When I was 13 years old, I was staying the night at my friend Tommy's farm. I was one of two friends that got to sleep over after his birthday party, and I remember we couldn't wait to go night swimming. Tommy lived on a massive farm where he owned a couple of animals like cows and goats, but the highlight of it was without a doubt the pool that he had. So we waited for everyone to leave and then quickly got changed, and were in the pool until like 9:30 at night. When we got out though, the mood of the night quickly took a turn. I was standing on Tommy's back deck drying off and looking over toward the cornfield that marked the edge of his property, and I could have sworn that I saw a few of the stalks swaying back and forth as if something had just ran through them. I focused on the cornfield and tried to see if I could notice anything else, when out of nowhere, I heard the eerie sound of an owl hooting behind me. I almost jumped out of my skin with how loud it was, and when I turned around, I realized why. I stood on the porch in awe as I stared at this single owl that had been perched right on the post that ran along the back deck. I had never seen one in real life before, and it was like it had me in some sort of trance. I couldn't stop staring at it. That was when Tommy grabbed me by the shoulder and yelled that we needed to get inside quickly. I shook my head and looked around confused as I heard Tommy talking again. "There's something in the cornfield," he said as we all rushed into the house. We slammed the door shut behind us and locked it just to be safe. And as soon as I got the chance, I asked Tommy what was going on. And that was when he told us that he usually didn't like going night swimming because it was too scary. I asked him why it was scary, and he said that something always watches him from the cornfield. As much as I wanted to think that he was being ridiculous, something about what he said gave me chills. I decided to take a look out of the kitchen window since it faced the cornfield, and at first, I couldn't see anything. But then my eye caught it. In almost the same exact area that I'd seen before, I could see some of the corn moving around. I showed Tommy what I was seeing, and the two of us locked on to the section of the cornfield. We must have been staring at it for about 5 minutes with nothing happening. I started to think that I was just seeing things. But then we both heard our friend Derek let out a loud gasp. I looked over toward him and saw that he backed away from the window that he was watching the field through and quickly ran over it and asked him what he saw. But before he could answer, I saw it too. I took a step away from the window to let Tommy through so that he could see, and we all stood there in terror as we watched what looked like a grown man emerge from the cornfield. He didn't step out too far from his hiding spot, but it was as if he was trying to look for us around the yard as we watched his head swivel back and forth. I asked Tommy if he could recognize who it was, but he was too afraid to say anything. So I decided to get his parents and tell him what we were all seeing. Tommy's dad quickly rushed over to the window and was surprised that we were telling the truth. I had never seen him so angry when he realized that the person who was watching was someone that he knew. Tommy's dad rushed outside after telling us to call the police, and he went over to confront the man who turned out to be their neighbor from 2 houses over. We all watched from the window as Tommy's dad yelled at the man until the police arrived. After that, we called my parents as well as Derek's, and we all ended up going to our own homes from the night. I tried talking to Tommy about what happened, and apparently there wasn't enough evidence to charge his neighbor with anything, but they were able to get a restraining order that required him to stay far away from his house and that cornfield. Sleepovers can be cool because sometimes you can meet new people through your friends, and that's what I thought happened with my friend James and his cousins. I used to stay over at James's house like every other night during the summer, and one year I started getting pretty close with his cousin Mike. There was even a night that he asked if I wanted to sleep over at his house. He said that we could play video games all night or even go out skating if we wanted to, so I told him that I was down. Honestly, I thought that James would be there too, so you can imagine how surprised I was when his cousin picked me up in his car and it was only us two. I felt like it was no big deal though and just decided to roll with it. I hopped into the car and tossed my backpack with all my stuff in it in the back seat, and before I even put my seatbelt on, we were pulling away from the house. Now, I had never been to Mike's house before, so I had no idea that we were going the wrong way until about 30 or 40 minutes into the drive, when I asked him how much farther away it is. That was when he looked at me with a blank expression on his face and said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about that, man. It's all good." I was confused and didn't like how vague he was being. I looked out of the window to see if I could spot any street signs that I recognized, but it was too dark out and we were driving too fast. However, not knowing where I was ended up being the least of my worries. I looked over to Mike and was going to ask him how far away we were again, but that was when I noticed where his right hand was. His left hand was planted on the steering wheel, but his right was resting in his sweatshirt pocket as if he was holding on to something. And I don't know what it was that gave me the feeling that I needed to get away, but I knew more than ever that I needed to get out of the car. I didn't wait for him to stop at a light or anything before I unlocked the door and pushed the door open. But what I didn't realize is that I didn't unbuckle my seatbelt. I started to fumble with it as I noticed Mike fumbling to pull his hand out of his pocket. And just as I unclipped the seatbelt, I could clearly see the back end of a handgun being pulled out. I threw myself out of the car and smacked down onto the pavement that I then slid across before I finally stopped. I got up as fast as I could and looked back toward the car, which had now stopped. I started to sprint as soon as I noticed Mike getting out of the car. I kept my head low as I ran down the road, and as soon as I heard the first gunshot being fired, I knew that I needed to get out of there. I looked around as I ran and saw that my only option was to duck into the woods and hope that I could hide while I called for help, so that's exactly what I did. I could hear the sound of bullets whizzing past me as it sounded like he unloaded his clip in my direction. Thankfully, he didn't manage to hit me, and as soon as I was in the cover of the trees, it only made it harder. I continued to run as fast as I could into the woods, and when I felt like I was far enough away, I decided to tuck myself behind one of the trees that had a large bush on the other side of it for cover. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and hoped that it hadn't shattered when I fell out of the car, and as soon as it lit up, I called 911. I tried to whisper as I begged and pleaded for help. Lucky for me, Mike had given up on the chase a little while before I had hidden behind the tree, and by the time the police got there, he was long gone. After making sure that I was safe, they went to Mike's house where they tried to arrest him, but he was nowhere to be found. It took them 2 weeks to track him down at one of his friends' houses, but when they did, he confessed to everything. After his trial, I learned that he was apparently going to kill me in order to be initiated into a local gang, and apparently he thought that no one would suspect him because he didn't know me like that. Those were his words. All I know is I'm happy to be alive, and you should be wary whenever agreeing to sleep over at someone's house. Sometimes you might not even make it there. I was sleeping at my friend Dakota's house, which I always loved and hated to do. I loved it because we always had fun during the day, but for some reason, weird things always happened to me at night, and this time was no different. We spent most of the day playing air hockey and running around the backyard before getting tired enough to watch some TV in the upstairs living room. It was around 7:30 by that point, and the sun had gone down, and I was starting to feel uneasy already when out of nowhere, I started hearing a sort of tapping noise coming from behind me. I looked around to see what it was, but I couldn't see anything. So I asked Dakota if he heard the noise too, and he clearly did. I tried to ignore it, thinking that it was one of the pipes or something, but as we watched TV, it was like the noise was getting louder and louder, and eventually, the tapping noise transitioned into a scratching. It sounded like someone was inside the wall, and they were trying their hardest to claw their way out. I couldn't pull my attention away from the noise, and it's like it didn't want me to, because it just kept getting louder and louder until eventually even Dakota's parents heard it. His mom came rushing up the stairs to ask us what we were doing, but as soon as she got to the top, it was like the sound miraculously just stopped. She looked at us like we were crazy when we told her that it sounded like there was something in the wall, and then his mom just went back downstairs. I hoped that that was the only thing that was going to happen that night, but about an hour after his mom came upstairs and the noise stopped, I heard it again. This time, it was while I was laying down to go to bed on the other side of the room, but somehow, the noise was once again coming from right behind me, and again, it started out as a tapping sound, And before I even got Dakota's attention, it had turned back into the loud scratching that we heard before. This time though, it almost sounded like the scratching was paired with a banging sound, like someone was trying to smash and claw their way through the wall. Both Dakota and I started to scream for his parents, but once again, as soon as they got upstairs, the noise mysteriously just stopped. They tried to calm me down, but I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't spend any more time in the house and asked if I could please use the phone to call my parents. As I waited for my mom to pick me up, I felt bad for leaving Dakota, but he used to say that those things only ever happened when I was spending the night. It took about an hour for my mom to get to his house and pick me up, but as soon as I got home, I was able to relax. That next Monday in school, I spoke to Dakota and asked if they ever figured out what the sound was. And all he said was that whatever it was stopped making any noise almost as soon as I went home that night. I rarely stayed at Dakota's after that, but when I did, it was never a dull night, and something weird always seemed to happen that we could never explain.